In our earlier video of examination tips to paper 6, that is IGCSE paper alternative to practical, we had seen many important points to consider while writing this paper, and we had also seen various types of questions which are asked in this paper and how to solve them. Now in this video we will be only concentrating on the last question generally asked on the investigation, that is planning an investigation, and you have to write it in a subjective way for approximately 6 marks. So in this video we will be concentrating only on that question. So we will be considering the points to consider while writing this question of planning an investigation. Then we will discuss various types of this question, that is investigation questions, and then at the end we will see important tips about writing this question. When we are writing this question of planning an investigation, the details of the experiment which we write, which we describe, should include important points. For example, we should include the apparatus or the equipments to be used. We should consider the conditions to be employed. For example, if we are using heat, or if we are considering some other example of measuring the temperature or measuring the time, we should be writing all those conditions. Then we should also write the measurements and observations to be made and how it should be recorded during the experiment. We should be comparing the experiments to ensure the fair test if we are performing two types of experiment in the single question. So that comparison has to be mentioned to ensure that there is a fair test done, and interpretation of the results at the end of the question to make correct conclusion according to the question asked. These are the important points we should consider while writing and describing the experiment of an investigation. Now these are the 3 important points which should surely know while writing an investigation, that is independent variable, dependent variable, and controlled variable. Now let's understand what does this mean, and then we will be discussing these points during the examples, which we will discuss different types of examples of the past paper question which we will discuss during this video. So independent variable is a variable or a factor which we are changing during the experiment, Now in the first question which I'll be discussing next, I'll explain what is independent variable and what factor which we change for the investigation. Dependent variable is a measurement we do. What factor we are measuring? The factor which we measure, that is the dependent variable. For example, if we measure the temperature by changing the concentration, or if we measure the volume of the acid required to neutralize a given base, then this is a measurement which we are doing. So this is a dependent variable. So such examples, temperature, volume, can be dependent variable which we measure. Now what are controlled variables? Controlled variables are the factors which we keep same during the experiment, For example, if we are measuring the temperature, then the volume of the liquid or the solution which we are using should be kept same. Or if we are measuring the temperature, the concentration of the solution can be kept same. So these are the things which has to be kept same, the factors to be kept same. They are called controlled variables, and we will be discussing these variables in our examples, the questions which I have taken from the past paper during this video. Now let's discuss the first example of this question is when solid C and solid D separately reacts with dilute hydrochloric acid, that is HCl acid. One reaction is exothermic and the other reaction is endothermic. Now plan an investigation to determine which reaction is exothermic and which reaction is endothermic and which energy change is greater. So we are supposed to make conclusions on this 2 points. So at the end we should be writing about these 2 points. Now you are provided with solid C and solid D, dilute hydrochloric acid and common laboratory apparatus. Now this carries 6 marks. So what are the points you should be considering while writing this investigation and scoring full 6 marks for this question? So now first thing which we should be doing is that plan out an experiment. Think of the procedure which we'll be doing. Now suppose if we are talking about exothermic and endothermic reaction, then for sure the measurement to be done is the temperature. Now if we are measuring the temperature, the apparatus which we'll be using should be thermometer. So we should be mentioning all these names. And what are we measuring? We are measuring the temperature when solid C and solid D are separately added to dilute hydrochloric acid. Now if we are measuring the temperature with the help of thermometer, that shows that we are mixing these solids separately with dilute hydrochloric acid and measuring the temperature. So think of the equipments which we'll be using, think of the apparatus which we'll be using, and think about the measurements which we'll be doing and measuring. Measurements like if we are using solid, then we should be weighing the solid C and solid D. So these are the measurements. Then if we are using a liquid like dilute hydrochloric acid, then we should be measuring the volume of the dilute hydrochloric acid. So if we are talking about exothermic endothermic reaction, then we should be measuring the temperature. Now what factors we are changing? We are changing solid C and solid D. So what are we changing? We are changing the type of substance which will be adding to dilute hydrochloric acid, and we will be measuring the temperature. So what is an independent variable? Independent variable is the solid C and solid D. That is the independent variable. Dependent variable is temperature, because that is what we are measuring. And what is a controlled variable here? Controlled variables are the one which will be keeping same. So what we can keep same is the volume and concentration of dilute hydrochloric acid. We can also keep the initial temperature same for both the experiments. Also we can keep the mass of both the solids same, because if we are using separate masses, different masses of solid C and solid D, then it won't be a fair test. So these are the factors which we will be keeping same. So these are controlled variables. So all these points you need to take care while writing the experiment. Now start writing in a systematic way, stepwise. So starting with the procedure, take a known volume. I'm writing in short, but you have to write it very descriptively with full correct spellings, because here if I write full, it's going to take time. So I'm writing it in short, but you need to write it properly. Take a known volume of dilute hydrochloric acid, say for example 25 centimeter cube. 25 centimeter cube of dilute hydrochloric acid is taken, and of known concentration. We are using known concentration in a beaker. Now that is also necessary that we mention the name of the apparatus which we use. So we are taking say 25 centimeter cube of dilute hydrochloric acid of a known concentration in a beaker. Measure the mass of solid C to be used. Maybe 1 gram or 5 gram to be used, and measure the initial temperature of the acid. Measure the initial temperature of the acid. Next step, what are we doing? add solid C in the acid and measure the temperature change. The maximum temperature which is reached, measure the temperature change and also note it down. Now the same thing has to be done, but now with solid D separately. So we can write, repeat the experiment with solid D using the same volume, concentration of dilute acid and same mass of solid D as solid C and measure the temperature change. This last sentence, if you are not comfortable writing, you can avoid writing. Also, if you don't have enough space, you can avoid writing this last sentence, that measure the temperature change, because we have already mentioned that repeat the experiment. So we don't need to repeat the sentence again. Now this is the whole procedure of the experiment. What is important now is we need to draw the conclusion. Now conclusion should be about two things, as I said, which reaction is exothermic and which reaction is endothermic. So here we need to mention that how are we going to make out that which reaction was exothermic and endothermic. So here we need to mention that the reaction in which the temperature increased is exothermic, and I'm writing in short, the reaction in which the temperature decreased is endothermic reaction. Now we have to write one more point about which energy change is greater. So the reaction in which there is a greater temperature change has greater change, energy change has greater energy change. That is what you are supposed to write in 6 marks, because all this procedure mentioning about the apparatus is very important, because all these are considered while giving the marks. So writing conclusion carries marks, describing the procedure carries marks, and mentioning proper fair test, that is use of proper factors affecting, factors which will change, factors which will measure, factors to be controlled. All this should be mentioned to get the full marks in this question. Now the earlier question which we did was a question of comparison. We were doing 2 experiments and we were comparing, but it may not be so. We may not need to perform 2 experiments and compare the results. We are here a different type of question discussing, is that an aqueous solution of barium hydroxide are alkaline. Plan an investigation to find the concentration of aqueous solution of barium hydroxide. You are supposed to find out the concentration. That is, you can say calculate the concentration. Now you are provided with aqueous solution of barium hydroxide and dilute hydrochloric acid of known concentration. Now that is the given 2 solutions, 2 chemicals which we are supposed to use and common laboratory apparatus. So when we are given the solutions of a base and an acid and we are supposed to calculate the concentration, the only method which can be used is titration. So now we know the method. Now we know about the procedure. Now we need to think that what are we going to keep same or what are we going to measure. Now here, if we are not performing two experiments, we don't need to keep any variable same or we don't need to change. What is important is what are we going to measure. That's the most important part. And then how are we going to calculate? We are supposed to find the concentration, that is calculate. So how are we going to calculate the concentration? So we can mention the formula also here. That is how we are going to conclude. So let's start describing the experiment, describing the investigation. First thing is, if we are using titration, we need to mention about the use of burette, pipette, conical flask and the indicator also. That is another important point, indicator. So we need to mention the name of indicator and the color change also. So suppose if we take barium hydroxide in the conical flask, we can take the inverse also. That is, we can take hydrochloric acid also in the conical flask. Suppose if we say barium hydroxide is taken in the conical flask, then we can mention take barium hydroxide, say 25 centimeter cube with the help of pipette, into conical flask, Now what are we supposed to do next? Add few drops of indicator. You can mention the name of an indicator like methyl orange. Few drops of methyl orange indicator. Now we need to mention the color change also. So suppose if we have taken base and the methyl orange shows yellow color in the base, so we need to mention the color will be yellow. Next we can write that fill the burette with known concentration of what is the acid which we are using? Dilute hydrochloric acid. So known concentration of dilute hydrochloric acid. Now you need to write it all properly with full spellings, because here as I am speaking and writing, I am writing it in short, but you need to write correct full sentences. So this is what we have done. Now next step will be start adding acid from burette to the conical flask. We are adding burette, filling the burette with the acid, and start adding acid from the burette in the conical flask till it shows what does it show? Till it shows the color change. Now here we can mention the change in the color, that is, if it is yellow in base, it's going to show red color. So still it shows color change to red. This is what we are going to specify. See, here we have specified known concentration of acid which we have taken in burette. We have mentioned the name barium hydroxide. We have also mentioned the volume which we took in the conical flask. So see, we are mentioning the apparatus, we are mentioning the volume. We should also know the concentration of acid. So that is also written here, and we have mentioned the name of the indicator with its proper color change. Now next we can write that note the volume of the acid required. Note the volume of the acid required. Now this is the procedure, but then how are we going to calculate the concentration? We are going to calculate the concentration with the help of the formula moles divided by volume, and we should also know the balanced equation for the reaction of barium hydroxide and HCl. That also, if required, you can write, but here I don't think that's required. We need the formula here. So that is mentioned and then we can say that using the above formula, calculate the above formula, calculate the concentration of the base. Concentration of which base? Barium hydroxide. Now I have written the formula, but it is good if you write the full name, barium hydroxide. So these are the few points which you need to write for 6 marks. Mention the apparatus, the volume, the indicator, the color change, and the formula to draw the conclusion. But remember, while using the name of the indicator, don't use the name universal indicator, because that doesn't show just one color change. It shows a range of colors which is not suitable for a titration. We can't even measure the pH, because depending on the type of titration, the end point will be different. So we can't use the pH meter also. So use a named indicator like methyl orange or bromothiamyl blue or phenolphthalein, and mention the color change for it if we are performing a titration. Let's discuss one more type of example here, where we are planning another type of experiment and measuring something else, and then we need to include a diagram here. That is another type of question which you need to think of. So you need to know the pictures of the common apparatus also, and that I have already shown in my earlier video, the different types of apparatus, its pictures with the name. So you can refer that video to look at the pictures of the apparatus and how to draw it. Here let's start with the next example, is that magnesium reacts with dilute sulfuric acid at a room temperature to form hydrogen gas. Plan an experiment to find the rate of reaction between magnesium ribbon and dilute sulfuric acid. Include a diagram. Indicate how you could use the results obtained to find the rate of reaction. So again, if we are calculating the rate of reaction, you are not comparing two experiments here. So for calculation, we need to mention the formula here. So let's again think of what procedure we will perform to measure the rate. Now if we are measuring the rate, what measurement we need to do? The measurement for sure is the time which we need to measure to calculate the rate. Now in this experiment, as I said, we are not comparing, so we don't need to measure the mass of magnesium, or we don't need to measure the volume of the acid. That can be used in a random way, so we don't need to mention it. What is important is that we are calculating the time and performing the experiment. So if we are performing the experiment and measuring the time, we need to take dilute sulfuric acid in some container and magnesium in the form of ribbon. So let's start to think of a procedure. The procedure is of measuring the time of what? Measuring the time either of the volume of the hydrogen gas produced, or we can measure the change in the mass. Why change in the mass? Because if hydrogen is lost out from the experiment, the mass of the reaction mixture is going to decrease. So that also can be done. Two types of measurements, two types of planning and investigation to measure the rate can be done. So you can either measure the change in the mass per unit time. Is very important, that if we are measuring the change in the mass, in what time? If we are measuring the volume of the gas, in what time? Time is important, and so in short we are measuring two factors here. Either the change in the mass and time, or volume of the gas and time. Two measurements are done. Suppose if we are performing about volume of the gas measurement in a given time, then how are you going to measure the volume of the gas? The most common apparatus which to be used to measure the volume of gas is using the gas syringe. So here you can draw, my diagram is quite rough because I'm not using a scale, but you can draw the diagram in a proper way using proper scale and eraser and everything. So here is the gas syringe we are drawing, and I'm drawing the graduations on the gas syringe because that is important. and here a cork has to be fit and the acid to be drawn, and you can also draw a magnesium ribbon here. So this is what you can use to measure the volume of the gas. Another method of measuring is change in the mass. So in that case again you need to draw the beaker, but this you can draw on the weighing balance. So you can mention here the weighing balance, label it properly, and here you need to show that there is a cotton wool and not the cork, and again the acid and the magnesium ribbon. Don't forget to label all the apparatus and also draw it properly. My diagram is rough, but I'm just giving you an idea how to draw. Now start describing the experiment. Description will include take a known volume of acid in a conical flask. Now as we are not measuring the temperature, we have nothing to do with the temperature, so no need to measure the temperature, but then mention you have taken acid in the conical flask. Now what are we doing? We should first mention arrange the apparatus as above. You are going to draw any one diagram out of these two, and then you can say arrange the apparatus as above. Apparatus as above. Because if we are going to measure the hydrogen gas, we need to arrange this gas syringe along with the stand, the bung and the conical flask. So arrange the apparatus as above, and then add magnesium ribbon in the flask. Start the stop clock. And measure the volume. Maximum volume we can mention maximum volume of gas produced during the experiment, and measure the time required for the gas to produce. So note down the time. Note down the time required for this. This is how we are going to write. Now this is the procedure. This is the only procedure required. We can complete the sentence and note down the time required to produce this volume of gas. Now the conclusion is about the rate. We need to calculate the rate. We have measured the time, we have measured the volume of the gas. So if we are calculating the rate is equal to volume divided by time. Now here you may write volume should be in dm cube, the unit, and time should be in the second. So that is how we are going to calculate the rate. So here if we are measuring the volume of the gas, then we can measure with the help of the gas syringe, and if we are noting down the change in the mass, then we need to mention that weigh the conical flask. Initial mass of the conical flask is measured, then magnesium ribbon is added, and then at the end note down the final change in the mass with the and note down the time required for this change of mass. That has to be mentioned if we are not writing about the gas. And again at the end the formula of the rate has to be mentioned. In that case you need to write in place of volume, write change in the mass divided by the time. This is what you will be describing and drawing the diagram also. So we have discussed here three various types of examples of planning and investigation. What is dependent, independent and controlled variables, what things to be taken care. Now while writing, let's understand what are the important tips which you need to consider. Let's revise. Say Think of the method for planning an investigation according to the question asked. Then next, you will be mentioning the name of the apparatus which you will be using or required during the experiment. In your procedure, you will be mentioning the names of the apparatus. If we are measuring using some chemicals, measure the volume or the mass or the concentration of the chemicals and mention it there, the known volume of the solution or known mass of the solid or known concentration of the solution, that has to be mentioned. Next, think of the variables and then keep it same. Mention that we are changing the solid or we are changing a substance, then we are keeping the initial temperature, volume or concentration of the solution same. What are we measuring, that or we are going to mention during this question, especially when we are comparing two experiments. Next, specify the names of the chemicals used. For example, if we are writing about the indicator, mention the name of the indicator and the color change. Then describe the whole method. What are we going to do after what step? And then at the end, conclude the experiment according to the question asked. For example, if we are supposed to calculate, find out which experiment is endothermic or exothermic, conclude how are you going to find out that. If you are going to calculate the rate, write the formula and say use the formula to calculate the rate. Or if we are measuring the concentration, write the formula and say use this formula to calculate the concentration. So this is what you are going to write down. So formula also need to be mentioned if you are using it during the experiment. So these are the important tips you should remember while writing the planning and investigation question of paper 6. This is very important because that carries the highest marks in a descriptive type of question.